Welcome again to the Basement Studio, giving you an overview of Pathos. Pathos, whatever you want to say. I'm joined today by Dylan, the pickle, from the Portland Pickles. So he'll be my guest today. If I need to use any examples on him, we'll see. But what we're talking about today is specifically appeals that fit under the Pathos framework, right? So those different appeals that establish people's emotions. Because remember, the whole idea behind Pathos is that you're appealing to emotions. So both as the audience, you, Dylan, and as the speaker, me, I can appeal to you and you can feel appealed by different choices I make with Pathos, with regard to Pathos. So here's the different elements, the different methods through which I can do this. Number one, sensory images and figurative language. So that's the first one. Number two, anecdote. Number three, humor. By the way, fear is also in there. Kind of any emotion around that framework. Number four, diction. So what words we choose. And then lastly, 5, needs. And needs are, of course, incredibly important and incredibly influential. So let's dig into those as much as we kind of need to here. So the first one, sensory images and figurative language. I think you get this, but this is just the author's choice of words that are going to cause you to feel certain things. So sensory images. And different images, of course, do different things for different audiences. So you really need to know your audience when you use figurative language or sensory images. But if I paint certain images in a way that makes you feel something, that's going to affect Pathos. So for instance, if I know that this group really enjoys the encounter, which I don't want to give anything away for you here because you're juniors going into this retreat, I could bring up certain sensory images that illustrate that encounter. And without giving anything away here, I might say the roaring fire at St. Benedict's Lodge, or the noise of the river. Noise of river is not very good, by the way. But the river at St. Benedict's Lodge. And that image will give certain people a sensory reminder and say, oh, I remember this. This works really well with memory, of course, right? And saying something that brings up something in someone's head. So for instance, it could be the way your parent might have helped you ride a bike when you were younger. That image evokes a feeling, and that feeling is what the speaker can use to kind of manipulate the audience. The next one is anecdote. And kind of similar to what I was just saying there, anecdote's though a story. And it's not a super long story, it's a prolonged story, but it's a story. And this happens a lot when we want to convince people anecdotally, meaning through the story, that something is true. So instead of relying on stats, figures, statistics, all those kind of things, we might tell the heart-wrenching story of an individual, or the really fun story of an individual. So for instance, we might say something like, you should give money to this charity because of this individual who otherwise wouldn't have been supported throughout their life, but thanks to this charity, they were supported. And of course, you're going to build up that story. You're going to give the person a name because specifics are important. You're going to say what their struggle was, how they grew up, where they are now. You're going to do all that stuff because it appeals to those emotions of the individual. And don't underestimate anecdotes for effectiveness. People love stories. People are really driven by stories, and it makes them buy in. So anecdote, I think, is one of the most effective Pathos appeals. And it's one that you definitely want to lock away there and say, what kind of anecdote could I use? And if you're keenly aware of a lot of things, oftentimes in essays that you're right, the teacher might say something like, write a story to hook the reader in. And that's because that anecdote helps us to understand what you're about to argue in the paper. The next one is humor. Obviously, funny things draw people in. The challenge with humor is you always got to balance it. Unless it's a stand-up like comedic routine, you can't just constantly be funny. If you look at speeches where they use humor, what you'll often see is the humor is utilized a lot at the beginning because you want to engage the audience, you want them to buy in. And then toward the end, the humor drifts away a little bit. So the humor is not quite as intense, or it happens throughout it from time to time. Next, we have diction. Diction is simply a fancy word for word choice. And what happens in diction is effectively your speaker, and especially your writer, chooses certain words. The example I've given you in class and I give to all my students is if I say, you're walking down the street and you find a kitten in the side of the gutter and it's covered in weeds and old leaves and there's a discarded bottle next to it and the kitten's barely breathing, it can hardly open its eyes. If I say all that, the fact that I chose kitten makes you feel a certain way that if I chose porcupine, you might not feel. And some of you might say, well, I don't feel anything toward porcupines, and that's fine. But imagine if I said a snake, for instance. Some of you might say, ooh, I don't like snakes. And so that choice of diction, that image, shifted how you perceived that anecdote, right? So the diction works within the larger anecdote. And so if you're talking about the pathos a speaker uses, you might start by saying they use sensory images, they use anecdote, but it's the diction that establishes the effectiveness of that anecdote or that figurative language, whatever that might be. Okay, lastly, and this one's a big one, Pathos Appeals will use needs, right? We all need certain things. Obviously, we all need air, water, food, that kind of thing. Those are like literally needs. But we also need other things. We need acceptance. We need love. We need hope. We need dream. We need dreams. We need all that kind of stuff because those things are central to just our enjoyment in life. The good rhetoric scholar knows this and knows that speakers are keenly aware of needs. Teachers do this all the time. They ask themselves, well, what do the students need? What do they want out of this class? And so sometimes the need is a grade. Sometimes the need is knowledge. Sometimes the need is simply being a part of a larger group. But if you utilize that need through your pathos appeal, that can be really convincing to the audience. So the first part of that is identifying what the need is. And if you're doing an analysis, you might say, hey, I noticed the speaker clearly identifies and articulates this need that the audience has. This happens in sales a lot, right? Because it's like the person is without something. So they're without the newest iPhone. They feel like they need it, or you can make them feel like they need it through your own manipulations of diction, those type of things, anecdote. I hope this helps. There is, again, a sheet online if you want to check out all of those and practice with your own examples, look for examples out in the real world, all that kind of stuff. The more you look for it, the more you'll see it, and the more you'll recognize that those things are always around you, and they're everywhere, and they are trying their best to appeal to you to do something, right? Whatever that purpose might be. Those are pathos appeals.